Hospitals are places of healing, but also of death. They are filled with stories of suffering, despair, and sometimes things far worse than death itself. Some of these stories are whispered among doctors and nurses during night shifts, while others are never spoken of again, buried deep in the minds of those who witnessed them. In today's episode, we will explore 5 disturbing hospital stories. Some are paranormal, others much more real, and sometimes reality is far more terrifying than any ghost. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare yourself, because these stories are as real as they are horrifying. I used to work as a night nurse in a small hospital in Ohio. One night, around 3 a.m., the intercom buzzed from room 209, a room that had been empty for months. At first, I thought it was a mistake. But then it happened again. A soft static filled the speaker, followed by a woman's voice. "Help me?" I felt my stomach drop. The room was locked. No patient had been assigned to it for weeks. Slowly, I made my way down the dimly lit hallway. My heart pounded as I pushed open the door. The room was freezing cold. The bed was neatly made, untouched. But the rocking chair in the corner? It was moving, creaking softly as if someone had just stood up. I stood frozen, staring at the chair, when suddenly the intercom buzzed again. "Help me?" But this time, the voice was coming from behind me. I ran out of that room and never looked back. Security checked the cameras later. They saw me enter, saw the chair rocking, but I was alone the entire time. I worked as a surgical intern in Mexico City, and I've seen a lot of messed up things. But this still haunts me. One night, an ambulance rushed in a man who had been stabbed 37 times. His wounds were deep, fatal. He had already lost too much blood, but he was alive. More than that, he was fully conscious. He stared at me as I worked on him, his lips curled into a twisted smile. "You're wasting your time," he whispered. His vitals were unstable, his body broken beyond repair. But he wouldn't die. Even as we worked on him for over 2 hours, stopping the bleeding, stabilizing his heart, he just wouldn't die. And then, just as the sun began to rise, he suddenly turned stone cold. No final words, no struggle, just gone. Later that morning, police arrived. They told us that he was a contract killer, one of the most brutal hitmen in the city. He had been tortured before being stabbed, but he had refused to give up any information. He had held on for hours, longer than humanly possible. His last words still echo in my mind. "You're wasting your time." To this day, I wonder, did he let himself die only when he wanted to? I worked the night shift in a psychiatric hospital. Most nights were quiet until he arrived. A middle-aged man was brought in by the police, screaming and fighting. He had been found in an abandoned house, writing symbols on the walls in his own blood. At first, we thought he was just another psychotic case. But then he started saying things he shouldn't know. He looked directly at me, eyes black like empty holes, and whispered, "Your mother is sick, isn't she? She doesn't know yet, but she will." I felt my blood run cold. My mother was perfectly healthy, or so I thought. 3 weeks later, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. That man was never identified. He had no name, no records, and disappeared without a trace. His bed was found empty one morning, even though the doors were locked. I never saw him again, but I will never forget his eyes. I once worked as an ER doctor. This is the most disturbing patient I've ever had. A homeless man was brought in after being stabbed in the throat. His windpipe was exposed. He was bleeding out, and yet he was laughing, not just chuckling, hysterically laughing. We sedated him, intubated him, and prepped him for surgery. But when the anesthesia took hold, he suddenly stopped laughing. Instead, he whispered one last thing before going unconscious. "It's okay, doctor. I'll see you soon." He didn't survive the surgery. The next day, I went home and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his laughter. A week later, a man broke into my house. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. The man walked into my bedroom, stood by my bed, and just stared at me. And then he laughed. I grabbed a knife from my nightstand, but before I could react, he was gone. Police never found him. But I swear, I know it was him. In the 1980s, a hospital in Romania was shut down for inhumane practices. But the worst story came from a basement. A nurse who worked there told me what she saw. She was new, exploring the building when she heard a baby crying. She followed the sound to an unmarked door in the basement. It was locked. She called for security, and when they opened it, they found a crib. Inside was a rotting corpse of a newborn, wrapped in a hospital blanket. The worst part? The crying didn't stop. Even with the door open, even with the crib empty, the crying continued. They sealed off that basement. The hospital was shut down soon after. But those who worked there still hear the cries, even decades later. I work as a paramedic, and I've seen a lot of death, but nothing compares to what happened one night in the back of my ambulance. It was past midnight, and we had just picked up the body of an elderly man who had suffered a fatal stroke. He was already pronounced dead at the scene. Rigor mortis had set in. There was no question about it. He was gone. We loaded him into a black body bag, zipped it up, and began the 45-minute drive to the hospital morgue. I was sitting in the back, alone with the body, filling out paperwork when I heard it. A deep, shuddering breath. I froze. The body bag shifted. I swear I saw it move. Then came the scratching. From inside the bag, slow, deliberate scraping sound against the thick plastic. My radio crackled. My partner's voice came through. "Are you hearing that?" I felt my stomach drop. He heard it too. I reached for the zipper, my hands shaking. Just as I touched it, bang! The body bag jerked violently, like something inside was trying to break free. I yelled for my partner to pull over. We rushed to the back, unzipped the bag, and there he was. Still, cold, dead, but his mouth was open. His eyes, which had been closed when we picked him up, were now wide open, staring at me with an expression of pure terror. We never spoke about it again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the scratching. I used to work night shifts in a hospital that was over 100 years old. We all knew the building had history, but there was one patient whose story haunted us the most. His name was Daniel Carter, and he died in room 404 back in the 1970s. He had been a war veteran, suffering from severe PTSD. One night, he had a breakdown, locked himself in his hospital room, and shot himself in the head. Since then, strange things happened in that room. The TV would turn on by itself. The call button would go off, even when the room was empty. And then there were the footsteps. Many nurses, including myself, reported hearing heavy military boots pacing up and down the hallway at night. But the cameras? They showed nothing. One night, I was doing my rounds when I passed by room 404. The door was slightly open, even though we always kept it locked. I stepped inside and froze. The bed was unmade, like someone had been sleeping in it. The sheets were warm. Then the bathroom light flickered. I turned my head and saw him, a man in a hospital gown, standing by the mirror. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken and black. He lifted his hand and saluted me. Then in an instant he vanished. I ran out of there and refused to ever enter room 404 again. To this day, hospital staff avoid that room because every so often, the bed still warms up and the footsteps never stop. Hospitals are places of healing, but also of horror. These stories remind us that not everything can be explained. Some things linger. Some things refuse to be forgotten. Thank you for watching Creep. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more terrifying real-life horror stories. And remember, if you ever hear something strange in a hospital, you might not be alone.